The year is 1985. Deep inside the 7th floor of CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, a man sits alone in his office after midnight. The building is nearly empty. Security has made their rounds. Outside his window, the Virginia woods stretch into darkness. Aldrich Hazen Ames methodically feeds document after document into a Xerox machine. The rhythmic hum fills the silence. Each page contains names, real names of Soviet citizens secretly working for the United States. Assets cultivated over years, sometimes decades. People who risked everything because they believed in something bigger than themselves. With each copy, Ames is signing their death warrants. By the time the sun rises, he will have compiled one of the most devastating intelligence packages ever delivered to a foreign power. Within months, nearly every major CIA asset behind the Iron Curtain will be arrested. At least 10 will be executed. The Soviet Union's intelligence apparatus will know virtually everything the CIA knows about them, and Aldrich Ames will deposit $50,000 into his bank account. This is the story of the greatest penetration of American intelligence in the Cold War, a betrayal so complete, so audacious, that it would take the CIA nearly a decade to believe one of their own could be responsible. It's a tale of hubris, incompetence, greed, and the catastrophic human cost of treachery. This is the story of how the KGB planted a ghost inside Langley.
To understand how Aldrich Ames became the most damaging mole in CIA history, you have to understand where he came from. And paradoxically, he came from the very heart of American intelligence itself. Born in 1941 in River Falls, Wisconsin, Rick Ames, as everyone called him, was quite literally raised in the shadow of espionage. His father, Carlton Ames, was a CIA officer who spent much of Rick's childhood stationed overseas, primarily in Southeast Asia. The family moved constantly: Burma, India, back to the States, then overseas again. For young Rick, the CIA wasn't some mysterious organization from spy novels. It was simply where Dad worked. It was dinner table conversation. It was the reason they lived in exotic locations and why certain topics couldn't be discussed outside the family. In many ways, Rick Ames never had a chance to be anything but a spy. But he wasn't a particularly good one, at least not at first. Those who knew him in his youth describe a young man of average intelligence, mediocre ambition, and notable insecurity. He wasn't the brilliant student who excelled at languages and analysis. He wasn't the charismatic operative who could charm secrets from diplomats at cocktail parties. He wasn't even particularly ideological or patriotic. He was, in the assessment of many who worked with him, thoroughly ordinary. Rick attended the University of Chicago, where he majored in history and developed a taste for alcohol that would follow him throughout his career. He wasn't failing out, but he wasn't distinguished either. When it came time to think about careers, the path of least resistance beckoned. Follow Dad into the CIA.
In 1962, at age 21, Aldrich Ames joined the Central Intelligence Agency. It's worth pausing here to consider what the CIA was in the early 1960s. This was the height of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall had just gone up. The Cuban Missile Crisis would bring the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation. The CIA was expanding rapidly, fighting a shadow war against the KGB across every continent. They needed bodies, they needed people, and they weren't always as selective as perhaps they should have been. Ames started, as many did, as a clerk. His job was to handle documents, maintain files, and support the real intelligence officers. It was boring work, but it gave him access to classified information, access to the inner workings of operations, access to secrets. In 1967, after 5 years of clerical work, Ames was finally promoted to case officer. Now he would be doing real intelligence work, recruiting and handling foreign agents, debriefing sources, and contributing to the great game against the Soviet Union. There's just one problem: he wasn't very good at it. Over the next 15 years, Aldrich Ames compiled what can only be described as an undistinguished career. He received assignments to Turkey, where his work was unremarkable. He was posted to New York, where he was supposed to target Soviet diplomats at the United Nations. His performance reviews were consistently lukewarm. Adequate, satisfactory, needs improvement in several areas. One supervisor noted that Ames had potential but lacks follow-through. Another observed that he seemed more interested in the social aspects of the job than the actual work. Multiple reports mentioned his drinking, which was becoming increasingly problematic. But here's the crucial thing: none of this stopped his career progression.
The CIA in the 1970s and early 1980s had a culture problem. Officers who came from CIA families, blue bloods as they were sometimes called, received a level of protection and benefit of the doubt that others might not. Carlton Ames had been well-liked, and Rick Ames was a legacy. More importantly, the CIA's Soviet East European division, where Ames worked, was a closed club. It was considered the most important division in the agency, the tip of the spear against America's primary adversary. Officers in SE division developed a sense of superiority, of being the elite, and they protected their own. So despite the mediocre reviews, despite the drinking, despite the lack of significant accomplishments, Aldrich Ames continued to rise through the ranks. Not to the top. He would never be in the running for senior leadership positions, but to a comfortable middle level where he had access to some of the CIA's most sensitive secrets. By the mid-1980s, Ames was working at CIA headquarters in Langley, in a position that gave him access to virtually every Soviet operation the agency was running. He knew the names of Soviet citizens spying for the CIA. He knew their code names. He knew how they were contacted, what information they were providing, and how valuable the agency considered them. He knew everything, and he was about to sell it all.
April 16, 1985. Remember this date. It's the day Aldrich Ames walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. and changed the course of intelligence history. But let's understand why. What drives a man to commit treason? For Ames, it wasn't ideology. He didn't wake up one morning suddenly convinced that communism was superior to capitalism. He didn't have some philosophical awakening about the evils of American imperialism. He wasn't blackmailed or coerced. It was simpler than that. He needed money. By 1985, Ames's personal life was a mess. He was in the middle of divorcing his first wife, a process that was both emotionally draining and financially devastating. He had fallen in love with a Colombian woman named Rosario Gasas Dupuy, whom he had met during an assignment to Mexico City. Rosario had expensive tastes, designer clothes, fine dining, foreign travel. Ames's CIA salary of about $60,000 a year wasn't cutting it. He was drowning in debt. Credit cards were maxed out. He was borrowing from colleagues. The lifestyle he wanted to maintain, the lifestyle he felt he deserved after nearly 25 years with the agency, was simply out of reach. And he had access to something extraordinarily valuable. Later, Ames would claim he initially intended only a small betrayal. He would give the Soviets just enough to solve his immediate financial crisis, then stop. It would be a one-time thing. A victimless crime, really. He'd give them some names of CIA officers, not actual Soviet agents. Nobody would get hurt. This is what he told himself as he walked through the gates of the Soviet embassy on Wisconsin Avenue that spring day in 1985. It's what all traitors tell themselves in the beginning.
Imagine you're a KGB officer stationed in Washington. Your cover is as a diplomat, but your real job is counterintelligence, identifying and neutralizing American intelligence operations against the Soviet Union. It's tedious work, lots of false leads and dead ends. Then one day, an American walks into your embassy and asks to speak to someone from the security department. This happens occasionally. Sometimes it's a walk-in with genuine information. More often, it's a mentally unstable person with nothing to offer, or an FBI provocateur trying to penetrate your operation. You've been trained to be suspicious of walk-ins. They're usually trouble. But this one was different. The man who entered the Soviet embassy that April afternoon, presenting credentials identifying him as a CIA officer. His CIA badge appeared genuine. He claimed to work in the Soviet East European division at Langley, and he had a shopping list. Ames's initial offer was straightforward. He would provide the names of 2 Soviet citizens he claimed were working for American intelligence. In exchange, he wanted $50,000. Think about this from the Soviet perspective. If this was legitimate, it was an intelligence windfall of almost unimaginable proportions. A CIA officer with direct access to Soviet operations, voluntarily offering information. Not some low-level clerk or disgruntled secretary, but an actual case officer in the division specifically targeting the USSR. But was it a trap? A double game by the CIA to feed them false information? The KGB had been fooled before. They decided to take the chance. The information Ames provided in that first meeting checked out. The 2 Soviet citizens he identified were indeed in contact with American intelligence. Within weeks, both were arrested. The KGB had just confirmed that Aldrich Ames was genuine, and they wanted more. What happened next occurred with breathtaking speed. On June 13, 1985, less than 2 months after his initial walk-in, Aldrich Ames did something almost unprecedented in espionage history. He compiled a package containing the names of virtually every Soviet citizen working for the CIA. Read that again. Not a few names, not a handful of less important sources. Every major Soviet asset the CIA had cultivated over decades of dangerous, painstaking work. The list included Dmitry Polyakov,
a Soviet general who'd been spying for the United States since 1961. For over 2 decades, Polyakov had provided invaluable intelligence on Soviet military capabilities, missile technology, and strategic planning. The CIA considered him one of the most important agents they had ever run. Codename Top Hat. Adolf Tulikachev, a Soviet aviation electronics engineer who provided detailed information about Soviet aircraft systems, radar, and stealth technology. His intelligence had been so valuable that it saved the United States an estimated $2 billion in research and development costs. Codename GT Vanquish. Sergei Motorin and Valery Martinov, 2 KGB officers assigned to the Soviet embassy in Washington who had been recruited by the FBI. They provided real-time intelligence on Soviet intelligence operations in the United States. Oleg Gordievsky, a KGB colonel working in London who had been spying for the British since 1974. Through intelligence sharing agreements, his information was available to the CIA. He was potentially the most valuable Western agent inside Soviet intelligence. And many, many more. Some estimates suggest Ames compromised more than 100 intelligence operations. The exact number remains classified to this day, but the damage was catastrophic. For this information, Ames received $50,000, though the Soviets would later pay him millions more. Think about what this meant. In a single afternoon, Aldrich Ames undid decades of intelligence work. Every carefully cultivated relationship, every dangerous meeting in dark alleys, every risk taken by brave men and women who believed they were fighting for a better world, all of it was compromised in hours. The Soviet response was swift and brutal. In the months following Ames's betrayal, the KGB arrested nearly every name on his list. Some were brought in for quiet questioning and disappeared into the Gulag system. Others faced show trials before being sentenced to death. Dmitry Polyakov was arrested in July 1986. He was interrogated for months, tortured for information about how the Americans had recruited him and who else might be involved. In 1988, he was executed by firing squad. The general who had served his country for decades, the man who had risked everything to prevent nuclear war, was shot in a basement of Lubyanka prison. Adolf Tolkachev was arrested in June 1985, just days after Ames's betrayal. The Soviets already suspected him, but Ames's information provided confirmation. He was tried, convicted of treason, and executed in 1986. Sergei Motorin was recalled to Moscow from Washington in October 1985 under false pretenses. He was arrested at the airport, executed in 1987. Valery Martinov suffered the same fate, recalled, arrested, executed. The list goes on. At least 10 people were executed as a direct result of Ames's betrayal. Others spent decades in brutal prison camps. Some were never heard from again. Each of them had families, wives, children, parents who would never know the full truth about what happened. Some family members were arrested themselves, guilty only of being related to traitors. And in Langley, something else was happening: panic.
By late 1985, it was becoming clear that something was catastrophically wrong. Assets were disappearing. Communications went dead. Sources who had been productive for years suddenly stopped responding. In some cases, the CIA learned through other channels that their agents had been arrested. In other cases, people simply vanished. One failed operation might be bad luck. 2 might be coincidence. But this was different. This was systematic. This was comprehensive. The Soviet East European Division was hemorrhaging sources at an unprecedented rate. Senior officers began to ask the terrifying question, did we have a mole? But here's where human psychology and institutional culture created a perfect storm of denial and delay. The CIA did not want to believe they had a mole. The implications were too devastating. If there was a mole, it meant their vetting process had failed. It meant their counterintelligence procedures were inadequate. It meant that everything they thought they knew about Soviet intelligence penetration might be wrong. Most painfully, it meant that some of their own officers, people they worked with every day, people they trusted, might be traitors. So they looked for alternative explanations. Maybe the Soviets had gotten better at catching spies. Maybe there was a technical breach, a communication system that had been compromised. Maybe it was bad luck, a statistical cluster of unrelated failures. Maybe the athletes themselves had made mistakes, gotten careless after years of successful operations. Maybe it was anything except a mole. This is not to say the CIA didn't investigate. They did. In October 1986, the agency established a small task force to analyze the losses and determine their cause. The task force had a deliberately bland name, the Special Task Force. Its mission was anything but bland: find out why CIA operations were failing at an unprecedented rate. But the task force operated under constraints that would doom it from the start. It was small, just a handful of people. It was under-resourced, and most critically, it was operating in an environment where the dominant assumption was that the answer must be anything except a mole in the Soviet East European Division. Why? Because the officers in SE Division were the elite. They were the blue bloods, the ones who had devoted their careers to fighting the Soviets. They were patriots. They were true believers. They couldn't be traitors. This assumption would give Aldrich Ames years to continue his betrayal. While the CIA struggled to understand what was happening, Aldrich Ames was living better than he ever had before. The money from the Soviets started flowing in immediately. That initial $50,000 was just the beginning. The KGB recognized they had landed the intelligence catch of the century, and they were willing to pay handsomely to keep Ames happy and productive. By 1989, Ames had received approximately $2.7 million from the Soviets. This wasn't money deposited into obscure offshore accounts or paid out in small, careful increments. This was cash, lots of it, deposited directly into his bank accounts in the United States. And Aldrich Ames spent it. He and Rosario, whom he married in 1985, bought a house in Arlington, Virginia for $540,000 in cash. This wasn't some modest suburban home. This was an elegant residence in one of the most expensive areas of the Washington, D.C. metropolitan region. He bought a white Jaguar, not used, new, with cash. He spent tens of thousands of dollars on home renovations, designer furniture, and art. Rosario wore expensive jewelry and designer clothes. They traveled internationally, Europe, South America, staying in luxury hotels and eating at the finest restaurants, all on a CIA salary of about $70,000 a year.
To any reasonable observer, this should have been an enormous red flag. CIA officers undergo regular financial reviews specifically to identify this kind of discrepancy. Living beyond one's means is one of the primary indicators of potential espionage. So how did Ames get away with it? Part of the answer is that he had a cover story. Rosario's family was wealthy. She had inherited money from relatives in Colombia. This explained the sudden influx of cash in the lavish lifestyle. Was this story ever properly verified? No. Did anyone check Colombian records or contact Rosario's family to confirm these supposed inheritances? No. Did anyone question why a woman from a supposedly wealthy Colombian family had been working as a low-level cultural affairs officer before meeting Ames? Not really. The truth is that the CIA's security systems had multiple points of failure, and Ames slipped through all of them. He took polygraph tests and passed them, or at least produced inconclusive results that were rationalized away. His financial disclosures were reviewed, but never thoroughly investigated. Colleagues noticed the Jaguar and the expensive house, but nobody pushed the issue. Because he was one of them. He was a CIA lifer, a second-generation officer, a member of the club. Of course, the money wasn't free. The KGB expected continued production, and Ames delivered. Every few months, Ames would meet with his KGB handlers. The meetings followed tradecraft protocols, though not always very sophisticated ones. Sometimes they met in locations around Washington. Other times, when Ames traveled abroad for CIA business, meetings would be arranged in foreign cities: Rome, Caracas, Bogota. The KGB used a handler with the codename Vlad, whose real name was Viktor Cherkashin. Cherkashin was a seasoned intelligence officer who understood the psychology of running a high-value asset. He was patient, supportive, and encouraging. He made Ames feel important, valued, appreciated, all the things Ames had never quite felt in his CIA career. At these meetings, Ames would provide updates on current CIA operations against the Soviet Union. He brought documents, sometimes copies, sometimes originals that he would return to agency files later. He provided information about new CIA recruits, about planned operations, about technical capabilities. The KGB's questions were sophisticated and specific. They knew what they wanted to know, and Ames had access to virtually all of it. For this continued service, Ames received regular payments. Sometimes it was $20,000, sometimes $50,000. The amounts varied, but they kept coming, and the damage kept accumulating.
Given how long Ames operated, you might imagine he was a skilled spy, careful and cunning, always staying one step ahead of detection. The truth is almost the opposite. Aldrich Ames was frequently careless, and he had several close calls that should have ended his espionage career years before it actually did. In 1989, Ames was assigned to Rome as chief of the CIA station's Soviet counterintelligence branch. This should have been a significant promotion, a chance to prove himself on the international stage. Instead, his performance was disastrous. He drank heavily, often showing up to work hungover or still intoxicated. He missed meetings. His work product was sloppy. His Italian colleagues found him lazy and incompetent. One Italian intelligence officer later said that Ames was the worst CIA officer I ever worked with. More dangerously, Ames met with his KGB handlers multiple times while stationed in Rome. On at least one occasion, he was nearly caught by Italian surveillance teams who happened to be monitoring Soviet intelligence officers in the city. Only luck and the Italian team's focus on other targets saved him from detection. When Ames returned to Langley in 1991, his performance didn't improve. He was often late to work. He took long lunches that stretched into the afternoon. He socialized with colleagues but contributed little to actual operations. And still, nobody seriously suspected him. There was one particularly telling incident in 1991. Ames failed a polygraph test. The examiner noted deception on questions about unauthorized contacts with foreign nationals and about his foreign travel. This should have been career-ending. At minimum, it should have triggered an intensive security investigation.
Instead, Ames was allowed to take another polygraph a few weeks later. This time he was better prepared. He had researched polygraph techniques. He had practiced controlled breathing and mental focus exercises. He produced an inconclusive result, which was considered good enough. He was cleared for continued access to classified information. Looking back, it's almost unbelievable, but remember the context. The CIA still couldn't quite believe that one of their own Soviet experts, someone who had devoted his career to fighting the KGB, could actually be working for them. It seemed psychologically impossible. This is a critical lesson in counterintelligence. Sometimes the truth is simply too painful to accept. By 1991, the CIA could no longer deny that something was seriously wrong. Too many assets had been lost. Too many operations had failed. And increasingly, the evidence pointed away from technical compromises or bad luck and toward human betrayal. The special task force that had been investigating since 1986 had made little progress. It was time for a new approach. In March 1991, the CIA and FBI formed a joint task force with a specific mission: identify and apprehend the mole who was betraying Soviet operations. The task force was given resources, authority, and a clear mandate. Leading the investigation from the CIA side was Sandy Grimes and Jen Vertfile, two counterintelligence officers who had watched the disaster unfold for years. From the FBI came several experienced counterintelligence agents, including Les Weiser and Jim Holt. Together, they began what would become one of the most intensive mole hunts in American intelligence history. The task force started with a methodical approach: create a list of every CIA officer who had access to the compromised operations. This was a daunting task. Hundreds of people had some level of access to Soviet operations. How do you narrow that down? They established criteria: who had access to all or most of the compromised operations, who had access during the specific time periods when the losses occurred, who had sufficient knowledge to portray not just one or two operations, but the systematic compromise they had witnessed. The list started to narrow, from hundreds to dozens to a more manageable number of serious suspects. And one name kept appearing: Aldrich Hazen Ames. Once Ames emerged as a primary suspect, the investigation intensified. But suspicion isn't proof, and proving espionage is extraordinarily difficult. The task force needed hard evidence. They started with financial records. This is where Ames's carelessness finally began to catch up with him. Investigators obtained Ames's bank records and credit card statements. What they found was damning. Large cash deposits appeared with no legitimate explanation. The timing of these deposits often correlated with Ames's foreign travel that could have included meetings with Soviet handlers. In 1985 and 1986 alone, Ames had deposited more than $1 million in cash into his bank accounts. His official CIA salary during this period was about $60,000 per year. The investigators interviewed Ames's colleagues and friends. A picture emerged of a man living far beyond his means, driving an expensive car, living in an expensive house, taking expensive vacations. When asked about this, Ames always had the same explanation: Rosario's family money. The investigators checked. There was no family money. Rosario's family in Colombia was solidly middle class, but hardly wealthy. There were no inheritances, no trust funds, no mysterious uncles who had died and left fortunes. Ames had been lying. But they still needed more. Financial discrepancies could potentially be explained in other ways. The FBI needed to catch Ames in the act of espionage. In 1993, the FBI began intensive surveillance of Aldrich Ames. They tapped his phones, they installed listening devices in his Jaguar, they followed him, they monitored his computer usage at CIA headquarters. And they waited.
One of the more fascinating aspects of the Ames case is how traditional spy tradecraft played out even in the modern intelligence environment of the 1990s. Ames communicated with his Soviet handlers, by this time Russian handlers, since the Soviet Union had collapsed in 1991, using a system of signal sites. These were predetermined locations around Washington where Ames would leave a chalk mark or some other subtle indicator to signal that he needed to meet or had information to pass. The FBI surveillance teams began to notice a pattern. Periodically, Ames would take unusual routes home from work. He would drive to specific mailboxes in the suburban Virginia neighborhoods around Washington. He would slow down as he passed, sometimes stopping briefly. The FBI investigators recognized what this was. Ames was checking signal sites for communications from his handlers. In one of the more dramatic moments of the investigation, FBI agents observed Ames placing a chalk mark on a mailbox in a prearranged pattern. This was his signal to the Russians that he had information to pass or needed to arrange a meeting. The FBI now had direct evidence of espionage activity. Ames wasn't just living beyond his means or lying about finances. He was actively engaged in classic spy behavior, using tradecraft to communicate with a foreign intelligence service. The net was closing. Throughout 1993, the evidence against Ames accumulated. The FBI's surveillance was relentless and comprehensive. They discovered that Ames had been conducting computer searches at CIA headquarters for information he had no operational need to access. He was looking up files on Soviet operations, checking the status of cases, and reviewing information about sources, all information that would be valuable to Russian intelligence. Computer logs showed that Ames frequently accessed classified databases late at night or on weekends when the office was nearly empty. He was printing out documents and making copies of files that had nothing to do with his current assignments.
The FBI also found evidence of Ames's meetings with Russian handlers. Through painstaking analysis of his travel records, credit card receipts, and surveillance, they could place him in specific locations at specific times when meetings were known to have occurred. In one case, investigators found that Ames had traveled to Caracas, Venezuela, supposedly for CIA business. While there, he had checked into a hotel, left for several hours, then returned. During those hours, surveillance teams from Allied intelligence services had observed him meeting with a known Russian intelligence officer. The pattern was unmistakable. The evidence was overwhelming. By late 1993, the FBI and CIA were confident they had their mole. Now they had to decide how to proceed. Do they arrest him immediately, continue surveillance to see if he leads them to other spies or handlers, try to turn him into a double agent? The decision was made. They would arrest Aldrich Ames. But they would wait for the perfect moment, a time when they could catch him with evidence in hand, when the case would be airtight and undeniable. That moment came in February 1994. February 21st, 1994. A cold, gray Monday morning in Arlington, Virginia. Aldrich Ames backed his Jaguar out of his garage, just as he had done hundreds of times before. He was heading to work at CIA headquarters. It was a routine day, or so he thought. As he drove down his quiet suburban street, a car pulled in front of him, blocking his path. Before he could react, FBI agents swarmed his vehicle from all sides. Weapons drawn, badges displayed, they ordered him out of the car. FBI, get out of the vehicle! Hands where we can see them! At the same time, other FBI agents were arresting Rosario Ames inside the house. The timing was coordinated precisely to prevent either of them from warning the other or destroying evidence. Ames later said he wasn't surprised. Part of him had been expecting this moment for years. He got out of the car without resistance and allowed himself to be handcuffed. "What is this about?" he asked, though he already knew. "You know exactly what this is about, Rick." At CIA headquarters, news of the arrest spread quickly. The Soviet East European Division was in shock. Aldrich Ames? Rick? The guy they worked with for years? The guy who came to office parties and complained about his divorce and drove that ridiculous Jaguar?
He was a Russian spy?
Aldrich Ames was transported to an FBI facility for interrogation. For the first several hours, he denied everything. The money was from Rosario's family, the computer searches were part of his work, the signal sites were coincidence. He had no idea what they were talking about. But the FBI had him dead to rights, and they knew it. They began laying out the evidence piece by piece, the financial records showing millions of dollars in unexplained deposits, the surveillance footage of him at signal sites, the computer logs showing unauthorized access to classified files, the testimony of colleagues about his lavish lifestyle. Then they showed him something that broke his resolve, photographs of him meeting with his Russian handlers. In Rome, in Bogota, in Caracas. The FBI had been watching him longer and more carefully than he had realized. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Aldrich Ames made a decision. He would confess. But he wanted something in return, leniency for Rosario. Over the following days, Ames provided a full confession. He detailed his initial walk-in to the Soviet embassy in 1985. He described the packages of information he had provided. He named the sources he had betrayed. He explained his tradecraft and his communications with handlers. The investigators listened in growing horror as the full scope of the betrayal became clear. Ames had compromised virtually every significant CIA operation against the Soviet Union and Russia for nearly a decade. He had caused the deaths of at least 10 people, possibly more. He had accepted more than $4 million in payment. When asked why he did it, Ames gave various answers. Sometimes he claimed it was the money. He needed cash and the Soviets were willing to pay. Sometimes he suggested it was disillusionment with the CIA and American foreign policy. Sometimes he claimed the people he betrayed were traitors themselves, so their deaths didn't matter. But the investigators believed the truth was simpler. Aldrich Ames betrayed his country for money, continued for money, and would have kept going for money if he hadn't been caught. There was no grand ideology, no moral philosophy, just greed, ego, and a fundamental lack of regard for human life.
The legal proceedings moved quickly. With Ames's confession, there was no question of guilt. The only question was punishment. Aldrich Ames was charged with espionage and conspiracy to commit espionage. The potential sentence was death. The crimes he had committed, betraying agents during wartime, the Cold War was legally still ongoing, carried capital charges. But Ames had one bargaining chip: his cooperation. He agreed to a full debriefing, to tell investigators everything he knew about Russian intelligence operations, to identify any other potential moles, to help damage assessment teams understand the full scoop of the compromise. In exchange, the death penalty would be taken off the table, and Rosario would receive a reduced sentence. On April 28, 1994, Aldrich Ames pleaded guilty to espionage charges in federal court. The proceeding was brief. When asked if he understood the charges, Ames replied quietly, "Yes, Your Honor." The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Rosario Ames, who had been aware of her husband's activities and had helped him evade detection, received a 5-year sentence. She was released in 1999 and deported to Colombia. Aldrich Ames was transferred to the federal supermax prison in Allenwood, Pennsylvania, where he remains to this day. He lives in a small cell, 23 hours a day in isolation, with 1 hour of solitary exercise. No contact with other prisoners, minimal contact with the outside world. He is now 83 years old. He will die in prison. After Ames's arrest, the CIA and FBI began the painful process of damage assessment. How much had been compromised? What did the Russians know? Were there other moles still operating? The damage assessment team, led by counterintelligence officers, spent months reconstructing what Ames had betrayed. They reviewed every operation he had accessed, every file he had seen, every piece of information he could have passed to the Russians. The results were devastating. At least 10 people were executed as a direct result of Ames's betrayal. The exact number remains classified, but some estimates suggest the true figure could be higher. More than 100 intelligence operations were compromised. This included not just human sources, but also technical operations, surveillance activities, and planned operations that had to be canceled.